Good evening, I'm Michal Žantovský. Welcome to the Václav Havel Library and its novel Havel Channel. It has been in operation for the Czech audiences for over a month now, but tonight is its true world premiere in English with a debate titled Will Freedom Survive the Pandemic? Bringing perspectives from 6 European cities by 5 leading international thinkers. If you notice the numerical discrepancy, the 6th person is yours truly as a moderator. This debate has been inspired by a remarkable book-length essay by the Bulgarian sociologist and political scientist Ivan Krastev called Is It Tomorrow Yet? How the Pandemic Changes Europe. The book was written this spring while it was all happening and published more or less simultaneously in 14 languages. Tonight's event is taking place in cooperation with the Charles University Center for Political Philosophy, Ethics and Religion and Karolinum Press, the Czech publisher of Ivan's book. Our discussants tonight are all owners of formidable, productive and original brains, all great Europeans, and I'm proud to say all friends. Naturally, it all starts, and not just because of the alphabetical order, with Ivan Krastev, head of the Center for Liberal Studies in Sofia, permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, author of a number of books, including Is It Tomorrow Yet? And countless articles, essays, aphorisms, and quips that not only make you think, but also make your life more entertaining. Welcome, Ivan. It's great to have you. Jiří Přibáň is a professor at the University of Cardiff in Wales. He sings, lectures, writes, and speaks on the philosophy of law, art history, sociology, politology, and sometimes even rock and roll. A truly Renaissance character, which would explain why he likes Tuscany so much. Welcome, Jiří. Jacques Rupnik is a French historian and politologist with a considerable Czech history, currently director of research at the Fondation des Sciences Politiques in Paris, and professor at the College of Europe in Brugge, Belgium. He was an advisor to President Václav Havel. He is the author of many books and papers, a frequent talking head, and many other things. In short, he is the embodiment of this very French institution of a public intellectual. Welcome, Jacques. Magda Vášáryová is a Slovak actress, sociologist, diplomat, and politician. Like me, she represented 2 different countries as a diplomat, having been the Czechoslovak ambassador to Austria and the Slovak ambassador to Poland. She was a member of the Slovak parliament. She currently teaches at the CEVRO Institute in Prague, and she's a great friend. Servus, Magda. And last but not least, Karolina Wigura is a Polish sociologist, historian of ideas, and journalist. She is a member of the board of Kultura Liberalna Foundation, which publishes Kultura Liberalna, one of Poland's leading weekly magazines. She is an assistant professor at Warsaw University's Institute of Sociology and a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. She's also this rare and much-needed creature among contemporary intellectuals in staying an optimist despite all the evidence to the contrary. Welcome, Karolina. Thank you for being with us. Since I suspect that much of tonight's debate will be devoted to doom and gloom, I want to start on a positive note. It is mind-boggling to realize that as recently as 6 months ago, we would not have probably even thought of having this discussion, although we had all the technical means and know how to do that. When I think of the few successful and the many failed attempts to bring one or more of you to an event of this kind in Václav Havel Library, of trying to work out, for example, the logistics of Jiří's morning train ride from Cardiff to London to connect to a flight to Prague in the afternoon, have him speak at the library in the evening and fly him next morning to Florence via Munich, it occurs to me that there is another paradox here next to the Ivan 7. Having been socially distanced from each other, we are much closer than we have ever been. For some reason, this makes me a little more optimistic about the future. But our topic tonight is the effect of the pandemic on freedom. Let us explore some of the aspects of this question that Ivan discusses in his book, and one or two that have come to the forefront since the book was written. The COVID-19 crisis led many, though not all European governments, to suspend, at least temporarily, some of the freedoms and liberties we have long taken for granted. This took place mostly, though not exclusively, through the democratic process and with a parliamentary approval. In retrospect, most, though perhaps not all of these measures have proved to be justified and effective in curbing the pandemic. Still, it was slightly disturbing to watch how easily people have given up some of the sacrosanct rights to privacy, freedom of movement, freedom of association, and in some cases, even the freedom of speech. Now that the West crisis is over, some are concerned whether and how soon we can return to the status quo ante, or whether some of the restrictions are going to stay with us for a long time, or perhaps permanently. The populists and the demagogues will use the experience to claim that freedom has been much overrated and that people are just as happy or happier without it. Now, starting with Ivan, how can we make sure that we don't come out of this with our freedoms and liberties diminished? Ivan.
Listen, we never can be sure, but there are three things that for me are quite important in this discussion. And one is that nevertheless that we can expect the kind of a long tail of the state of emergency to have an effect on the way the society functions when the extraordinary measures have been lifted. This is quite important in my view to understand that exactly because of the fact that the state of emergency was introduced at the same time in many different countries in Europe, it strangely constrained its effect. Because you're staying in your apartments during the lockdown, and don't forget, it was not so much fear, but it was uncertainty that paralyzed both people and governments. You don't know what is going on. You don't know what kind of virus, you don't know how it's really going to work. And basically, when you don't know what is happening, you do what others do. Because if you're not going to do it, then you're going to be accused of not doing it if something goes wrong. But after you're doing this, I do believe that people, while you don't have oppositions, while the debate have been very much silenced, all the time start to compare what is happening in their countries with what is happening in other countries. And this was the way to control the governments. It was paradoxically, I spent the time of lockdown in Bulgaria, and this was on one level closing of people, but for many people living in the countryside, for the first time they understood that they're living in the world. Because they can change the channels of their TV sets. And at the end of the day, if it was a primetime news, nevertheless of what language it was, they have the feeling that they know what people were talking about. And you all the time compare the number of the infected, the number of the people that have died. So from this point of view, I do believe many people overreacted because they tended to see the restrictions in the same way they had seen it during the war on terror. Well, this time it was slightly different, and particularly when it comes to the surveillance, people are not simply afraid that they're going to be infected, they were very much afraid that they can infect somebody else and they can become the reasons for the suffering of others. And my last point is, after staying for a while with these restriction measures, you could be right that the governments can decide, that can easily go back, but you also see how people jump on the street on the first time when they have this possibility in order to protest and to be there together. I do believe that particularly part of the dynamics of certain type of a protest that we see in the United States and Europe is very much related to the COVID-19. After 2 months without sports, without kind of being together, people went on the streets, not simply because they have been outraged by certain political events, but because they tried to get their subjectivity as a collective subject. So from this point of view, yes, you have a restriction of rights, which basically make governments probably more kind of hungry to go back to it. But on the other side, I do believe that it did not create in the majority of the people kind of a nostalgia to stay locked at home.
I take the point about comparison. Suddenly, you know, we were all locked down at home, yet connected to everybody else. And at least seen from France, you know, as a 68er that I am, in 68, the economy closed down and everybody was in the street. This time, the economy closed down and everybody was at home. And what were they doing at home? They were obsessed with watching TV, including myself. I've become a major expert on Corona. You can question me on any aspect of the epidemic, and I'm ready for a PhD in comparative COVID studies. So that is what it does to you. But it's true, the comparative element is there, but it's not enough to induce that everybody does the same. We have seen that you had different responses. You first have a liberal response. That was initially Holland. They backtracked on that. Sweden maintained that. No quarantine. And you had very strict countries very early on, you know, adopted very tough measures. And that is, I think, interesting to see. Those who took very tough measures very early on. And you may think, oh my God, you know, this is some authoritarian instincts. But of course, they pride themselves on the fact that this was the most effective way to combat the corona. So that is certainly one aspect. The second is what you mentioned, how easy we accepted this idea that we should stay put. And of course, there were very good sanitary reasons for that, but the easiness with which, you know, a politician and a doctor next to him, and the fact that a doctor is standing next to him, I think is one of the new things that we have seen in redefining political legitimacy in our time. You know, we have had this debate about technocracy versus populism, etc. Well, here what we have, this new model, is a politician come in, and next to him is a doctor. And the politician says, because he knows his legitimacy is relatively weak and often has been questioned before the epidemic. So he has a doctor next to him. He's a man of science, and science takes over. And the legitimacy is borrowed, so to speak, from science. So there is some kind of transfusion of legitimacy from the knowledge to the politician. It has only one snag. The scientists among themselves were in disagreement very often about what is a correct step to take. And we have seen plenty of those debates. And I would have things to say about the deconfinement and how quickly we can, so to speak, recover. The really important question for me is, what is it we recover, and do we recover fully, or is there a part that we gave up of the freedoms, of a certain habits, of a certain, that we gave up during the corona crisis, and that will not be retrieved or taken back? That was the same question we asked after 9/11, when the Patriot Act was adopted in the United States. Many people asked that question. You know, suddenly they have access to your internet, they have access to your email, they have access to everything, etc. How easy will it be to recover that? And we know that that is very, very difficult. So in a way, this is a challenge for those who are concerned with those issues like ourselves, is to make sure that in the phase that is starting now, we make sure that we recover as much as possible of those abandoned freedoms.
Well, this all sounds quite benign so far, but you know, there were some troubling moments some of them were cosmetic. I mean, in our Czech case, the doctor standing next to the prime minister in a face mask was also a colonel. That, you know, is cosmetically it's not the right impression. But more seriously, I was particularly concerned by one measure that the Czech government took, namely, for the first time since 1989, it banned people from leaving the country, which, if you think about it, can hardly be justified by concern about not infecting other Czech people, because if you leave the country, you know, you're going on to infect other people, but not our own dear citizens. And I was kind of, you know, trying to envisage what would happen if someone tried to cross the border. Would the border guards start to shoot or something? And actually there was some poor guy who tried to cross from northern Bohemia to Poland and got arrested. So this is maybe a little more troubling. And then there's the Hungarian case. You know, Prime Minister Orbán used the time of the pandemic to give himself the right to rule by decree with very few constraints or limits even after the pandemic is over. So maybe it's not all smooth sailing. I don't know.
If I may add to that, can I? Okay,
yeah, please.
I completely agree with what Ivan and Jacques said about legitimacy and about the state of emergency, which was declared in almost all countries in Europe simultaneously. And it shows striking differences. In countries where democracy and institutions are robust, this wasn't a big problem because everybody knew that these things can happen and you have state of emergency for a limited period of time for the particular purpose of combating the pandemic. And these acts should be within constitutional and proportionate and done proportionately. And Czech Republic is an interesting example. I was also astonished by the locked borders. It looked extreme to me. Nevertheless, these acts and these measures had been challenged before courts. Courts acted, and the measures then were removed sooner or later. So, were they unconstitutional? We should realize this, and we have still some techniques how to do it. So it was this state of emergency within certain social contract. In countries where democracy was already hardly breathing, I'm afraid that COVID-19 turned out fatal, and the case of Hungary is exactly this example, because it was abused for the purpose of seizing the last bits of control over the opposition, money-wise, political-wise, and so I agree that the state of emergency itself isn't a problem. The question is how you handle it, how quickly you remove it, and how robustly it can be challenged by legal institutions and by the public, such as in the United States, when police violence is challenged, cannot be challenged legally, it has to be challenged on streets. And in terms of legitimacy, there is a big question, because yes, you have a scientist speaking the hard knowledge, scientific knowledge, episteme, and you have the public opinion of politicians, doxa. And now we know that even this science speaks many different voices, and politicians have to define which scientific advice, have to decide which scientific advice they want to follow. And so we reached new art of politics, the art of judgment, which science to follow.
So I would like to go back to one of the initial questions concerning why we firstly got used to the new measures so quickly. And then there is another question which is asked in Ivan's wonderful essay: why do we forget so quickly? And I think it's very crucial to ask those two questions, because if you remember the beginning of the novel by Marcel Proust, In Search of Lost Time, you have Swan and he has difficulty sleeping. So he is tossing and turning in his bed all night. But basically he says, he thinks that the whole reality around him is turning around and he is staying still. And he says, the reality is not something real, it's created by our minds. And I do believe that when we talk about normality, so what we are accustomed to, what we are used to, this is again, in a way, a kind of creation of our minds. So it's a little bit, again, like in Ivan's book, when he writes that, well, is it tomorrow yet? Well, tomorrow basically happens every day, yes, because our reality is changing so fast. The reality has a protean nature, and COVID only accelerates this protean nature. So the question about freedom, I believe, is a question about constant understanding that it is not that we are waiting for any kind of normality that is going to come. The normality is exactly today. It's today. This is what's happening today. And I believe that only when we understand that and when we remember that, then we can answer the question about freedom. Because when we ask about freedom and the COVID quarantine, I believe that the longer the quarantine was, the bigger luxury freedom actually was. And it was not only in authoritarian regimes that Jiří mentioned, also in well-established democracies, exactly for the reasons that you have been mentioning, and exactly for the readiness of citizens to accept those new restrictions without much deliberation. So I would like to basically say two things: that deliberation really matters and it shouldn't be a luxury. And if you, Michael, ask us, how can we say freedom, then I will answer by deliberation. It shouldn't be a luxury. And the second thing is that the deliberation, and I do believe that the quarantine has showed it profoundly, deliberation also should concern emotions, because it's emotions that have been so extremely strong, a strong experience during the quarantine.
Magda.
May I start and bring to you a very, very interesting news. Virus as a threat is completely forgotten in Slovakia, because we have so many other problems. First of all, we belong to the countries with the less deaths and problems during the corona crisis, but not because of the activities of the government. And this was very interesting. The government was passive at the very beginning, so the citizens started to fight against this, collecting some information from the epidemiologist. We have such a very good man, a very experienced man who is working in Africa. So he was followed, and he have said, please, masks on your mouth. And everybody in Slovakia until today is in masks. So this was not really following only the government. The government, and seeing the government in the TV and our new prime minister was a kind of theater for us, sitting at home and seeing him. But we knew before him what is going to be and what is better. So this is one thing. We know exactly from 1993 how our government and how our bureaucracy is weak, how we have a problem in the health sector. So nobody of us was believing that the government will help us. My God, not. We know exactly that we are going to help each other. And that's why there was a huge wave of solidarity among the people. Everything was forgotten of the hate towards Roma or hate towards old people. But what is very interesting, the new surveys now, the last day, 2 days ago, they are showing that the problem with the quarantine and with the pandemic and everything, there is not a problem of elder people, but the young people between 18 and 30. They are now signalizing that they have depressions. They don't see the optimistic future. They don't know how to do now because they lost their stability and security. Most of us was taking the pandemic as a voluntary act, deciding not to wait for official recommendation. So the credit of the success of whole Slovakia today goes to my fellow citizens, not to the capacity of the state.
Okay, this is quite extraordinary because Slovakia, in comparison, has been really very successful. And what you're telling us, Magda, is, you know, what is the government good for? I mean, in other countries with more robust and more efficient governments, they did not fare nearly as well as Slovakia. I am not quite sure whether we should draw this lesson, but Ivan wants to step in, so maybe he has some
I also have some interesting data from 9 of the countries in the EU that ECFR did, and which is going to be published, I do believe, this week. But I start to go with something that, the problem is that, in a strange way, COVID-19, we know, is particularly harmful to patients with pre-existing condition. And this is true in life, but this is true also in politics. And Hungary, for example, was a patient with a pre-existing condition. Honestly speaking, when people said, oh, but he closed the parliament, listen, he closed the parliament in which he had a constitutional majority. So from this point of view, it's quite interesting to understand that from time to time, we are trying basically to blame COVID-19 for certain things that were not there. It simply amplified the trend which was much there. And when I was talking to many people in Hungary, why basically the Prime Minister Orban decided to do what he did, the explanation was very simple, but I'm very much ready to buy it. What he really feared was a consensus. He was feared that the opposition can decide to support a normal kind of anti-crisis measures. And because Orban fears consensus in the way kids fear darkness, because the anti-political polarization basically is a kind of a crisis of the political system, he came with this idea of unlimited extraordinary measures, which he knew that the opposition cannot accept. Not the measure, but exactly the fact that it was like this. And I'm saying this because there are two things listening, and I very much agree with what I heard, but on expertise. The ECFR survey showed that we are slightly in the illusion that as a result of the COVID-19, people get more trust in the experts and expertise. In fact, we ended up with 3 totally different types of people. ones who really believe that knowledge matters, expertise matters, and when it comes to public health, you're going to listen to the medical experts and not basically to your friends. Then comes the second group who said, we cannot trust science because every scientist has a different opinion, and because nobody speaks on science, the very nature of the doubt of the science basically makes it unbelievable. But interesting is the third group, which is 1/3 of the population, who said probably experts could be trusted, but at the end of the day, they're instrumentalized by the politicians. And in your case, you have a colonel, we have a general who was the medical doctor. But the story is that as a result of this crisis, we didn't get more trust in expertise. And the biggest example of this is something that I don't know why is not much discussed. Listen, if you listen to our discussions, you believe that if there's going to be a vaccine, we can have kind of the end of COVID-19 crisis. But then go on the opinion polls and you're going to see that only half of the Americans are ready to allow to be vaccinated. Even today, I read that 1/3 of the Slovaks said that they're not going to allow to be vaccinated. So having a vaccine which people are not basically ready to use is not solving a problem. So from this point of view, this was not the end of mistrust. As many of us in the beginning, to be honest, I also believe it. And then you go with the closing of the borders. And for me, this was critical also in these essays. There was a moment of the nationalistic instinct, but it was very different than the nationalism during the refugee crisis. The nationalism during the refugee crisis was purely ethnic. It was by origin. And the dream was all Bulgarians would come back to Bulgaria and all the foreigners would leave. During this crisis, the Bulgarians were not very happy when people like me decided to go back because we're coming with a high risk of infecting. At the same time, people are much more inclusive when it comes to foreigners and even minorities, because you need everybody to follow the same rules of social distancing. There was a special kind of a way to try to convince, for example, people in the Roma communities that we should be together in this. So yes, this is a nationalism, but it's a different one. It's much more territorial. This is a nationalism based on residence and not on origin. And in my view, trying to see this crisis and this type of a nationalism as simply as the return of the refugee crisis is much more going to blur than clarify the problem, at least as I see it.
Well, it's not really nationalism. I think it's xenophobia, you know, xenophobia towards people from the next valley. I mean, as historically it existed in many mountainous places in Europe. I mean, the phenomenon of people from the cities trying to go to their second residences in the countryside and being not warmly welcomed by their fellow citizens happened all over Europe, I think. And it has nothing to do with nationalism, but it has to do with distrust towards the other.
But you know, by the way, second houses, what we're talking, second homes, was very much the result of the plagues. In the 14th century, because of the plagues in Florence, the wealthier part of the population decided to create summer houses in which they can go or send their families in the time of plague. So, but what in my view is interesting is, yes, but you can also see this as a form of social distancing. And of course, people realize that nevertheless, that as if we're equally threatened by the virus, it's different from different social groups. Even the message, stay at home, assumes that you have home.
If I can add to this, one thing which I really liked about the book, that essay of Ivan, was the conceptualization of home. Yeah, that all of a sudden, if they tell you stay home, you reconceptualize what the meaning of home. Yeah, so and you realize that home makes the sense if you can leave it, and borders make sense, Michael, as you pointed out, if you can cross them. Yeah. And so we all of a sudden are in a very different mind setting in which we know that home is the other, and you have new forms of social distancing along some old lines, equality, inequality. In Britain, we speak about the nation divided by the gardens, those who had gardens and those who didn't. And to survive without a garden during lockdown is much harder mentally, socially, physically than so the old division of the nation of the rich and the nation of the poor all of a sudden acquire different meaning during. So what I want to say is that the COVID crisis didn't completely recalibrate our freedoms, our democratic politics. It only speeded up and magnified some old issues which were long overdue in being resolved by politicians.
Magda?
May I try to critique to the text of Ivan? Something is not there. Something is not mentioned there, and it's happened in Slovakia now. And this is the speediness, how the alt-right forces nowadays in the parliament, they are trying in the very quick and short time to attack the human rights, so women rights. This is really very, very surprising. And this is example is from 1938, when the first step of the fascist Slovak state was to realize a law against the women's rights. And this is the case now in Slovakia. We have now in parliament four laws about the abortions, about how to deal with it, how to deal with in vitro, and so on and so on. And very quick, they want to let it pass during the parliament.
Do you believe that it's not going to happen if it was not for COVID-19? Because
this speediness would be not possible, because now we are not able to protest.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So this is the problem. So, and all bishops and the bishops' conference is backing this. So this is a really, for us, active women, very, very unpleasant situation, because we are not able to go and protest in masses, yes, with other men, of course, and our families. So, and they are trying to do this really, really, really quick. And when we will lose this battle, so it will be much more, much visible consequences than the whole virus crisis.
I see Carolina wants to respond, and Jacques too. So Carolina first,
yes,
please.
I'm really very much touched by one dimension here, which is a dimension that usually very much interests me, namely how the private is connected and connecting itself with the public. And I do believe that this is exactly the case that we should discuss this. And when I think about the hardest quarantine measures during 2 months, basically, that I lived through in Warsaw, or as Ivan mentions in his book, survived in Warsaw, because the people who lived through the pandemics or epidemics in the past were called survivors. So it really, with all proportion, the emotions and the playing of memory brings to my mind only one experience, and it is birth pain, because I do remember that it was very difficult, but I don't know anymore how and why. So it's a recollection of something that has become already quite abstract, with the restrictions being taken away, lifted, And I think it's extremely important when we think about the public life, because when we discuss about this with my family, we basically think we have lived through something extremely difficult together, and now we feel much better, but the experience, although it is forgotten to some extent, it comes back in waves. So those are waves of frustration or lack of communication, etc. And now when we think about our societies, when we think about the very intensive protests around the globe, for example, the protests against racism, and at the very other side of the reality, when we think about those people who would like to keep the reality frozen, that it doesn't change. So, for example, those people whom you are mentioning, Magda, when you talk about them, I think about those Polish politicians that are attacking the LGBT community, and as if they believed that they can freeze the reality, make reality stop changing. So I understand those rapid and vast social and political movements as, so to say, waves of post-frustration. Now, if you ask me whether they would occur without COVID, probably so, but COVID to a large extent was catalyst to those radical emotions that are underlying both the protests and also the politicians' attempts to keep reality as it is, instead of accepting that it has a very protean character.
Jacques? Well, to continue on this, there is maybe the attempt in those movements, not just the decompression after 2 or 3 months of a lockdown, but there is also the idea that for 2 or 3 months, you've been telling us that the only thing that matters is the medical condition, life. We are here to save your lives, so stay put. And this is the only thing. Life matters. Your lives matter, so to speak. That was the politicians' way. Your lives matter. So everybody was repeating every night, and they were giving the death counts. You know, there was a politician, the doctor, and then there was a death count, you know, so many victims every day. So your lives matter. And now these movements, I feel, are partly the decompression, as Karolina just said, and also the idea that suddenly, let's shift the topic a bit, because this has been the focus for 2 or 3 months, and maybe that was necessary in the first place, maybe, but we must not pretend that this is the alpha and omega of our polity and our political engagement. And so there are various attempts to shift this political agenda from the medical to the economic. That is one. People who say, your agenda was to say, lives matter, let's close down the economy. But what if when you close down the economy on a global scale, because this has been done on an unprecedented scale, on a global scale, you close down the economy, that has consequences for lives, for people who will be starving in various parts of the world. So there will be casualties of that too, except of a different kind of casualties, okay? So this is one kind of shifting the agenda from the medical, let's say, primacy of life matters to the economic survival, so to speak. And then you have those, Karolina mentioned, who say, well, there are other issues that have been put under lockdown as well, and that are now resurfacing. So this is interesting how the politics will play out now, because it's not necessarily those who were the best during, the politicians, I mean, those who were the most successful during the management of the pandemic, that they will be necessarily the ones best equipped to provide the answers to the economic agenda that is coming up, or to the various social demands that are being expressed right now in various parts of the world, and in Europe in particular.
I would maybe like to go back from the social to the individual and reflect a little on the psychological aspect of it, because I was intrigued by what Karolina said about not even remembering the experience in detail, but remembering how difficult it was and how frustrating it was, and then we got to talk about the effects of the frustration and the possible connection to the protests around the world. But you know, the COVID here is getting a bum rap. You know, I need to say a few kind words about the COVID, because I don't know about you, but parts of the experience of the 2 months in isolation that we also went through was actually not so unpleasant. You know, one realized how many things one can get along without. I was positively relieved that I had a schedule of overseas trips and trips around Europe that I had to cancel. Well, you know, not so bad. And there was this feeling, and I'm so happy that Ivan writes about it in the essay, the feeling hard to pin down on being at home and being with your family, not being disturbed by the myriads of you know, disruptions and interferences from the outside world. And isn't there something in the experience we might like to keep? We might like to savor a little? Of course, we can't, you know, live like that, because, you know, the world would probably collapse and many people would suffer. But for a week, maybe?
What was interesting to me, and of course, when we stay there, we have been reading different things, and I was very much reading historical stuff, and 3 things shocked me. One was that our minds are designed in the way that we really remember revolutions, wars, where you have a protagonist, but we don't know how to remember major natural disasters like epidemics that have been extremely important for changing our way of life. Black Death in the 14th century. In the book, I have been quoting what Laura Spini was telling about the Spanish flu. 2 or 3 times more people died during the Spanish flu compared with the World War I. But there are 80,000 books about World War I and only 400 about the Spanish flu. And part of the problem with the pandemic is that everything is arbitrary. There is no meaning. In the war, you're dying and they're telling you that you're sacrificing your life for the nation. There is a story that you can tell. And now there is no story. Everything is changing, but nothing is happening. If you're going to ask us how we have been trying to save humanity, it was by staying home and watching Netflix. It does not come as a story. And I do believe this is quite important for me, and this goes to the what Magdalena said. I very much agree with you on the following. The street sounds to be much more important for us after we left than before. This has started before, by the way. Do you know, none of us is talking about parliaments, but one of the major losers out of this game were the parliaments. Because when the institutions have been divided on essential and non-essential, in many of the countries, basically, parliaments ended being as a non-essential institutions that you can send home. I do believe that consolidation of the executive is going to be one of the long-lasting things. It didn't start here. It had been there before, but it is much stronger than ever. And as a response of it, the moment when people wanted to do something, they did it on the street. And this kind of an empty street and the relations between elections and protests, I do believe it came much stronger than ever before. And on the level of individual, just to stop here, you go around, and now we had the feeling that we know better who we are. Strangely, if you go in the historical chronicles, what people suffered most about, for example, plague, is not simply that you're dying, but that you not have a funeral. Death without funeral is what basically the pandemics have been about, because you don't go to the funeral, even to the closest of your relatives, because you're afraid of being infected. And this story of not living together individually, but dying individually, is what scared people. In Italy, there was a Zoom funerals. There was a Zoom funerals because even the church decided not to do public events because they were afraid of infection. I do believe there was something about the very idea of individuality, community, that was basically rethought during this experience intellectually, but I do believe also in the everyday experience of people who are never going to write the books about it.
I like this shift towards individual and private, but what was probably most traumatizing was this loss of sociality in physical terms. Yeah, we all could go online. We had a lot of communication, but we had very few face-to-face, real, intimate gatherings. And so this cancellation of society at the most intimate, the most face-to-face level was, is, and will be traumatizing. But and this includes those funerals on Zoom. But I wouldn't overestimate that impact, because when you look at these plague waves, Athens was in complete turmoil, Pericles died, yet the classical age of Athens flourished. Out of the medieval plague, we have Boccaccio, we have Chaucer, and I think maybe this is actually period which, from the consequentialist perspective, maybe we will have a great cultural revival, and this will be reflected in art and not just in politics. So in terms of, when we speak about freedom, in terms of artistic and intellectual freedom, I think we can hugely benefit from COVID. That's why I liked your provocative question, Michael, about, is there something positive to say about COVID? And
yeah, but you know, this is also the new normal, because as it is, I see you, Jiří, from about 30 centimeters full size. I see your facial gestures, everything. If we were face to face, physical face to face, we would probably have to wear masks. Yeah. So I keep being intrigued by how many things we can do with these new technologies in communicating with each other, and I believe we've only scratched the surface. I mean, there are many other ways to handle this, and except for the sense of smell and taste, which will be, I think, the last to be mastered.
Yeah, well, we have sort of shared in this experience of self-isolation and contact through these media. But the other interesting thing, I think, from that period was that, given the suddenness of it, given the radical, you know, the closing of the economy, I think this is, you know, one thing is people afraid of catching a disease, but the other thing is the whole country being closed down, the economy not functioning. And that is something unprecedented. And I think that has brought about a different kind of thinking about who we are, where we headed. You know, this is a moment to pause. Before we started, we were discussing Milan Kundera. Well, he wrote a novel called Slowness, you know, and the whole post-89 world was, of course, about speed, network, movement, fluidity, you know, fluidity of borders, of identities, of people moving back. Okay, everything is on the move. And his novel Slowness had identified one of the problems. And suddenly we were forced to slow down. And many people thought that there's a virtue, not just in the slowing down, but perhaps in the opportunity to reconsider the fundamentals of the world we had been building patiently since 1989 onwards and upwards. And with that special twist is that the post-89 world was a world without a project, without a utopia. The project is you're building democracy and capitalism and markets, and you are globally connected. And if you're of a certain type, you mainly believe in the global market. If you're slightly differently inclined, you might believe there may be something like a global civil society and global human rights. Well, good luck to you. And that was a paradigm, but that was not a blueprint for something. That was just a way of organizing the world. And suddenly we discovered, we knew it before, of course. This is back to the idea that it simply has brought us to recognize what was there, that this is over. And that some people say, well, we should do the utmost to return to so-called normal. And others were saying, no, let's use it as an opportunity to think differently. And that can be about the economy. I see that in Oxford now they had this big survey about global universal income, etc. Is this plausible? Is this a good thing or not? Environment, of course, a big thing, the connection between the way we think about the economy and the environment. You mentioned the artistic, the culture that will flourish after the pandemic. Well, I hope you are right. Well, I'm not totally sure about it, but the sometimes not very profound, but the sort of utopian streak that reappeared, I thought was an interesting element in that moment. The idea, oh, we must, nothing must be the same as it was before. This is what we are going here. This is such an existential moment. We must not flunk it. We must not, just as you say, a crisis shouldn't go wasted. Well, an existential crisis should not go wasted even more so. And that return of the utopian moment, maybe it is just a moment, and I don't want to overdo it, but that I thought was something that is interesting, that maybe this may be the opportunity in this global conversation, because this is not something that is happening in one country, it's happening globally. Maybe the one thing that we will take back from this experience of the last 3 months.
Magda?
Add something to this. The Slovaks, probably we are completely different. They were very happy to have 2 months of vacations, because that was the springtime, and the gardens were waiting. Now the Slovaks newspapers are full of articles how people are happy because the gardens are now the best gardens and the flourishing gardens around the whole Slovakia. The garden shops were opened as the first shops in Slovakia. So everything is flourishing. Yes. And nobody was thinking about the consequences you are talking about the economic consequences. It will come, but it was springtime, nice springtime, sunny days, and everybody was happy working in the gardens. Beg your pardon, you are dealing with the intellectual debate, but this is the situation, and this was situation in Slovakia. But now, and other things, that was 2 programs in TV every day. Corona was not so interesting because so few people with coronavirus, and only 28 people died. So it was not so interesting, but was interesting one thing, because there was the recovery of the robbery in the state budget in Slovakia. Yes, because party Smer and Mr. Fico and all these guys are now to be seen as a big robbers, like Jánošík was, but Jánošík was only 2.5 years a robber, and now the Fico was 12 years. That was fantastic robbery in Slovakia. Second, we have now new government coming just at the beginning of crisis, and we have now Minister of Finance, and there were many programs with him because he's a priest of the Baptist Church, and he was not speaking about the finances, about the problems of our state budget, but about the Holy Ghost, which is going to work with him. And we'll save Slovakia because he is full of Holy Ghost. That was much more interesting than anything you have seen in your life. Please.
I just want to remark that I very much like the sociology or politology of gardens that has been already present in Jiří's and Magda's remarks, and I do believe it's actually very important because it seems that quarantine has been either very difficult or very easy, or perhaps a relief to some, in connection to what space they basically had. And space is one of the most important measures in sociology, like, for example, in Georg Simmel, who said that there are basically 3 measures. It is the number, space, and time. And it all counts in a quarantine because it's about number of people with whom you are spending your life. It's about time and what you do in your time, and it's about how many square meters you have, and how you are able to move from one place to another. And if I say that the quarantine might have been very difficult to some, and also Michal said very rightly, you are very right to say that for some it was also a relief. It was a great experience. But it is exactly because our habits connected with those 3 measures have been profoundly changed. Or to put it in a different way, our feeling of obviousness of those measures and how they work in our lives simply changed. And here comes what Jacques defines, I believe, that this is an existential moment. Or you might also call it that we have all been taken out of the comfort zone. And from neurology, we know that when we are taken out of the comfort zone, we are ready to learn, basically. So it might be a very good moment.
Yeah.
But then, and this is my last remark, the question is about political leadership. I mean, if such a moment is met by good leaders, wise leaders, then perhaps we have a chance to strengthen our freedom. If not, then perhaps we are to strengthen our distrust and polarization, as it is happening, for example, in my country, but also in many other countries right now.
How right you are. I mean, Magdalena was speaking about the Slovak Jánošík model. It not only seems to work there, they're exporting it. If you get my meaning, but Jiří.
Okay. Interesting connection to utopia that Jacques was talking about, because the book starts with dystopias. And Ivan writes from a dystopian moment, and here in Britain, a lot of people, of course, everybody was mentioning Camus and the plague, but a lot of people noticed, or some people noticed, John Wyndham's The Day of Triffids, yeah, when time and space dissipate, and utopias and dystopias have something similar. These are exactly these moments that you realize that things can go very different and you can construct your social and political reality. Right now, we are in a very happy transitional period. The pandemic is receding and economic crisis isn't in full force yet. What is coming next is probably, in political terms, the importance of the state. The state will become an important institution in our lives, so we will have to rethink the relationship between an individual and the state, civil society and the state. The temptation to authoritarianism will be there, so how to preserve and keep not just constitutional democratic state, but the state which knows its limits, which remains liberal, pro-freedom, and which is not the ultimate political settlement, but which is the political institution leading towards supranational and global collaboration, even cosmopolitanism that Ivan talks about, that Ivan writes about. So this rethinking of the constitutional and democratic state, which must become more efficient, yet the power of which we have to challenge by all means, it's probably the next big thing to the economic crisis which is looming.
This thing about the reconsidering, rethinking the state and the citizen and will almost certainly take place, other things staying the same. But you know, I've been wondering whether they will, and that brings me to the geopolitical aspect of the pandemic and the impact on various parts of the world. And it's probably too early to tell, but one quite plausible hypothesis is that China will become more assertive and that the United States has been weakened by the pandemic, and that the Atlantic connection between Europe and the United States has been weakening for some time, and with the addition of Brexit even more so. So what this is going to do with our ideas of freedom and democracy, what it's going to do to the European Union and its way of organizing or disorganizing itself, and where is the next point of gravity, point of organization going to come from? Because we are now standing in front of some major European decisions, and they will certainly affect the way we live in the next decades, but it would be very difficult to say that during the height of the pandemic, the EU was the organizing principle of anything. It was not. And so which way is the world going to go, and where does that leave us? Ivan, now.
Thank you very much. I just want to start because of all these books that were trying, I mean fiction, to use the kind of pandemics as the metaphor of loss of freedom, the one that spoke most to me was Saramago's Blindness. Because his story is not so much about how pandemics are destroying our freedom, but how pandemics allow us to see how our freedom was destroyed already before. And this is something that when I told you about this survey that I spent some time reading carefully this last week, here is the interesting story about Europe. First of all, our talk that people started to believe very much in the state, not strongly supported, by the way, by the data. The reality is that state is becoming very big, but it's not on demand. It very much depends in which state you are. Germans, Danish, felt much more confident about their state. But believe me, 70% of the French declared that as a result of the COVID-19, then they're even more mistrustful to the state. There is not a single European society which believes that European institutions did a good job. We can explain why they didn't do a good job, but this was the story. But at the same time, you have 70% of the people who claim that as a result of this crisis, they want more European cooperation, by the way, not integration. And the result is the following. The most important thing about COVID-19 in the mind of the Europeans was how we saw the world outside of Europe. 1/3 of the people became much more disillusioned about China and where China stands for. So we see a much more aggressive, kind of a power face of China. But what was really dramatic was the collapse of the image of the United States. And this is big. I mean, it's all over. And this is, people are going to claim it's about Trump. Partly it's about Trump. America didn't play the role that usually plays in this crisis. But part of it is you see this totally, the most powerful and rich country in the world, which spends 17% of its GDP on health, that cannot deal with kind of a simple pandemics, and also looking as a country on the edge of civil war. So as a result of it, strangely enough, what Europeans basically learned from this crisis is first that we have been putting too much faith in the multilateral institutions, because you expect that with the pandemics, there's going to be a global coordinated response, and it was not there. And secondly, that basically European Union is not a dream anymore, but this is the default option. If basically Europe wants to make any difference, we should try to consolidate. And I'm saying this because if you read the data, unlike in the previous crisis, there is no dividing line between pro-Europeans and nationalists. Paradoxically, many nationalists are ready to empower the European Union because they do believe this is how they're empowering the nation state. We made the 3 groups of people on the basis of the data. Those who believe that we are going to be back to the Cold War. This is around 15% of the population that believe that basically it's going to be clash between a democratic camp led by the United States against the autocratic camp, which was led by China. Do you know where this group is the biggest one? Not in Eastern Europe. It is very much Italy and France. And then you have the second group who believes that we are back to the 19th century. At the end of the day, it's only the nation states, and the nation states should find their way to try to reposition. Do you know where this group is the largest one? In Germany. Germans get so self-confident as a result of the crisis that basically they said probably the only thing that could be trusted. And then you have around 50% of the people who said if the world is going protectionists, the only effective protectionism is on continental level. We need European Union not so much to promote globalization, but as a kind of a response to the crisis of globalization. And these people said, yes, it's not about dreaming and this and that, but we're ready to empower European Union because otherwise Europe is going to be totally marginalized. And I do believe this is a new situation. For the first time as a result of the COVID-19, you have this type of articulation of what Europe is about. I do believe people like President Macron have been always insisting on this strategic autonomy. And I found this important because as a result of this crisis, comparing with the global financial crisis, the role of Germany changed totally. Before, Germany was very much the pro-status quo power. After this crisis, for the first time, you see Germany putting itself as a transformative power within Germany itself, within the European Union, with the Merkel-Macron plan and so on. So this is the paradox of the crisis. European Union, if it's going to end up consolidated, which cannot be taken for sure, this is going to be not because of the successes, but because of a newly discovered vulnerability and weakness. And basically, this is our kind of crisis to believe that we can rely on the United States. And this was the parting with the illusions that basically China is only about economic interests and things like this. We saw that they want to play a power game. So I do believe paradoxically, this is the biggest thing. And it's not new. And probably many of these trends have been before. But now people who had never been interested in geopolitics saw the world as different than the world before. And I want to end on something. Strangely enough, there is a particularity comparisons between this moment and 1989 moment. Then, of course, you have also the idea of a very big transformation, but then you have the idea that you know the direction of the change. And now you have expectations that many things are going to change radically, but you don't know the direction of the change. You do believe the change can go in all directions at the same time.
Yes, well, you know, when one asks geopolitical questions, the next question usually is who is the winner, who is the loser in this? And I think there are almost everybody is a loser in some respect, because even the Chinese, who in the first stage appeared as to be saying, look at the decrepit Western liberal democracies unable to face this challenge. And we actually had in Paris the Chinese ambassador coming on TV to say as much, you know. So that was quite something to stomach, I must say. And so that was the first stage. You know, we had the pandemic, we control it, we are effective. He actually said, because we value collective freedom of the nation more than you, because you give primacy to individual freedom. Your behavior is individualistic, therefore egoistic, therefore you are unable to face it. So there was I think this was a very early stage in which maybe some people thought that this Chinese approach helped with providing masks to Italians, etc., etc. This mask diplomacy, as it was called, that it actually highlighted the changing of guards, you know, the decline of America and the rising of China. I would say this has turned around. This has turned around. The Chinese discover, well, that their propaganda stunt has not been as successful. Many people are now discovering that they lied about it, etc. You know all the arguments around it. They lied about it. Well, first of all, it came from China. You should be at least acknowledge why it came from China, for what reasons. They lied about it. They were not terribly helpful. And eventually they sold us the masks, that some of which we had provided. European Union provided 56 tons of medical material to China in January, early February, before it knew it will need the material in the following months. Anyway, so the second reason why China would not be the great beneficiary, because if there is an economic downturn, and if there is a deglobalization process, well, China is unlikely to benefit from that. They have been thriving for 30 years on globalization. I will not dwell on the United States, because I think we are all seeing this picture, this other of the US, not only at odds with China, but at odds with the EU itself. For the first time, an American president calls Europe an enemy. Well, that's new as well. And most Europeans cling to the idea that there will be a change of guards in November. We don't know about that, but the decline of America, of its international role, we can see what it does in the Middle East. If you don't want to go any further, look from Syria to Libya, what it does. And that's a powerful message for Europeans. The real novelty is something I didn't think was possible. And that was that after 2 years of Macron's eloquent speeches about Europe, not getting any answer from Berlin, eventually, in the context of the COVID crisis and of the new international setting that I had just referred to, Angela Merkel decided she wants to go down in history, not just as Mutti and a good keeper of the German economy, but as somebody who leaves a mark, an imprint on the future of Europe. And that has been, for me, this coming back together of the Franco-German tandem in this new European proposal, which, as Ivan says, is not something brought by a great inspiration and hopes of a radiant future. It's brought by fear, brought by the reckoning that the economic consequences that we have to face collectively are just of such proportions that no single country can face it on its own. Not even Germany, with its strong economy, can face it on its own. It's not in the German interest to see the economies of half of Europe going to the dogs. That is not German interest. And that's not actually the interest of the so-called frugals either. So that is new, that maybe in the COVID crisis, the first reflex is nation state. You go back, you cling back to the country, you close the borders, and you think that, you know, Europe is not effective, Europe has not been able to do this, but what matters is the state capacity to provide the basic care. But when you then face the economic picture, and the crisis that is looming, that is already starting, there you have to, nobody can think in terms of nation state alone. You still think of your national priorities maybe, but you can see that the only way to look after them is this European matter. So I was very harsh critic during part of the COVID crisis about Europe. I would say we have seen a kind of usual 3-time waltz. You know, well, Milan is almost Viennese, so he knows about waltz. So it takes 3 times. The first is, oh, we were not prepared. Oh, COVID crisis, etc. Second tact is we are divided. We don't. we're not sure what to do about it. And the third act actually is we have found a way out of it, but a way that completely changes the ball game. What has been agreed is a major departure. So that will remain the COVID crisis as a catalyst for something the Europeans were not prepared to do after the financial crisis of 2008. And call it federalism by any other name, call it rampant federalism, call it whatever you want. But this is basically what it's about.
Karolina?
Yes, it's because, Michał, you asked about what might happen as for the global politics and how it might change. And I kept thinking about the fragment in Ivan's essay when he says that comparing with the Spanish flu, we might still be in summer 1918, meaning that we actually don't know even whether COVID will be gone by the end of the year, or perhaps it will just stay with us for a year, 2 years, 3 years, who knows? So I started to think, if we were in 1918, would any one of us be able to actually grasp what was going to happen to Europe itself and more broadly to the world? So I do believe that it's impossible basically to foresee the trends. The only thing we can do, in my opinion, is to try grasp the current of things that is unfolding before our eyes. And I would just like to mention 2 dimensions. First dimension is the one that interests me very much, and it is emotions. So sentiments, I believe, are a very important actor in global politics and in what is happening basically to various countries and also to global politics. I do believe that especially if you look at East Central Europe and the beginning of the quarantine, it was visible that there were a lot of anti-globalist sentiments and even perhaps anti-Schengen sentiments in the way that the East Central European countries, for example, closed their borders so quickly, just after Italy, even though the number of COVID cases were actually, the numbers of COVID cases were actually very, very low. So I do believe that it revealed a lot of anti-globalist and anti-European and also anti-Schengen sentiments, and I believe it's very important to grasp that. But Michal wanted me to be more optimistic and to say something positive about the quarantine. So I would like to say that there is one measure. I'm not really sure about what I'm saying now, whether this will prove to be the truth. But you remember Alexis de Tocqueville, and when he wrote that democracy basically is not a political system interested in serious political leaders or great political figures. It is actually a system that is interested in mediocrity. But we have at least a few examples of COVID-19 bringing a crisis that actually brings more serious politicians to power, or at least to public interest. So you may name, for example, Angela Merkel here and her political style. In Poland, you might mention Rafał Trzaskowski, who is the new opposition candidate, who literally jumped in the shoes of his predecessor, Ms. Kidawa-Błońska, who was a weak candidate in presidential run. He's much more serious. He's a much better candidate, and probably he's taking part in the run would never be possible without the COVID-19, and how it actually changed completely Polish politics. So I think it's extremely important. The last example is, of course, the US and how the Donald Trump, that has built his capital on not being serious, is actually now having severe problems with remaining a president. He might lose his post in a couple of months. So I do believe that this is something we could also reflect on.
Okay, that I'm saving Trump for the last, but Jiří.
Okay, thank you. I had talking of geopolitics. And the thing that I like about the conclusion of that essay is that it's in paradoxes. Ivan writes about paradoxes, and we know for some time that globalization runs rather as glocalization, that some things are global, other things are local. And I want to defend the European Union now, because it was never set up as an organization that could declare the state of emergency. So what could it do in the opening weeks of the pandemic? It hardly could do anything. It was down to the state power to declare the state of emergency. Now we are in a different stage, and it's interesting how Europe is taking unprecedented steps, even in contravention of what different institutions in powerful states, such as the German Constitutional Court, think. The court ruled that the European Central Bank, European Court of Justice, their judgments, their measures are against the European law and the German constitutional law. Couple of days later, ECB basically points a middle finger at Karlsruhe court by declaring here is 500 billion of euros as a corona bond, basically corona bond crisis help and solution. Because we know that this crisis, this economic crisis, cannot be resolved at nation-state levels, which brings me to the question of legitimacy that we started with almost. Because in the end, this crisis will be measured by legitimacy as efficiency. And the question of freedom is a question of value, but at the same time, what is freedom for me if it doesn't work? So it's a big challenge for democratic societies to set up their institutions to the working, which would help economically, which wouldn't be politically authoritarian, and which would take things seriously, which is about Trump. And I like what Karolina said, that he is the president who thrives and who campaigns on not being serious. But COVID is serious, COVID is real, and I think that this legitimacy by efficiency will be pushing against him and will be pushing in favor of supranational institutions such as the European Union. And the paradox of the European Union today is that exactly Europeanization will have to fight against the globalization as we knew it.
All right.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much. We are lucky, we're Slovak, because we have Our Lady President, who is able in a very interesting style to overcome many, many debates in Slovakia. Because my questions would be, when we speak about the people's expectations and how the people feel themselves and so on, my questions would be, who influence our citizens? That they think this way. And this is going to be a very serious question, because without the free, effective media, public media, we are not able to survive this situation. For example, the propaganda. You are talking about the China, but not only propaganda from China, but propaganda from Russia and from our sources. Because if we want to know what the people are thinking, we have to know first who is influencing them. And that was the most important also during the Corona crisis, our public media. And that's why when Mr. Kaczynski won for the first time for 6 years ago, the parliamentary elections, there was a meeting with Mr. Orban close to the Polish-Slovak borders, and one of the device of giving to Mr. Kaczynski was, please, you have to conquer public media. And that is the case. So what is for me important, that we desperately need from the European Union a pressure to have really good and efficient public media. This is one of the key roles, because if we are speaking about the problem, how will our people think about this 2 months of quarantine, or about the problems we faced? These meanings will be influenced by our debate, our analysis, but also what will be in the public media. Otherwise, our people will be under the influence of propaganda, who is really very dangerous. We are able to speak about Trump, about Merkel, but if our people will not keep on our public media and good public media, we are facing the very serious problem.
Well, I understand, Magda, but you know, I'm in two minds about what you're proposing. I know for sure that at this point the EU is not in a position to regulate public media in member countries, and I'm not quite certain whether it should. You know, I would be slightly afraid that this could backfire and be exploited by the nationalistic, anti-public media, anti-freedom of expression forces that will scream to high heaven about external interference into our sacred domestic media. It's hypocritical, we know that, but unfortunately it's often effective. But my friends, we have about, well, 20 minutes, that's not so bad. And I would like us to tackle one more issue that didn't quite exist at the time Ivan was writing the essay, and that is the wave of protests that started with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and that has evolved into a, you know, not quite global, but certainly American and European phenomenon, and it's quite different from what we've experienced recently. We've seen the biggest challenge to freedom and democracy, to the status quo in both Europe and the United States until now, as coming from the right, from the populist forces, xenophobia, nationalistic forces, etc., etc. What we're seeing lately, and Jacques will remember it because we are both old men, will remember it very well, you know, resembles 1968 in Western Europe and in the United States. It's a challenge from the radical left. It's has the symptoms of the iconoclastic expression of overthrowing statues and tombs and whatnot, and I don't think we've seen the end of it. I think we've seen the beginning of it, and there are obviously many young people around the world who seem to think that whatever the governments and the European Union and the US government and the state governments do is irrelevant, because the system is what's wrong, and they seem to be challenging the system and urging a much more radical transformation than many people are ready for. So how is that going to impact freedom, liberal democracy? Tell me. Ivan is going to tell me.
Ivan is just going to start it. And it goes back to something that basically Jacques was discussing. And this was this utopian impulse, which comes, listen, if you're young people, nevertheless on the left and on the right. For example, imagine that you're a climate activist, and you have been dreaming all your life that all the planes should be landed. But you never believed that this is possible. And then they landed overnight. Or if you had been a radical nationalist, and you have been dreaming that overnight all the borders between the EU member states are going to be resurrected. And they have been resurrected. So suddenly the idea of the possible has been changed. And you're going to have two totally different trends. On one level, nostalgia for normality, which was the mainstream, and where people, even which yesterday believed that normality was abnormal, now started to think about pre-COVID-19 world as a normal one. And then you're going to have the radical groups in society, which goes there. And in my view, there's three interesting things on this. One is you compare with 1968, but there is one major difference, particularly in Europe, and it has to do with demography. In 1968, the young generation was a very big cohort. There were many of you. Mm-hmm. Now we're talking about demographic minority. There are not enough young people. In a certain way, in political terms, basically, they're always going to be outvoted if they're simply going there. Secondly, what for me was very interesting in the American kind of situation is that you have a movement that is very much addressing the problem of historical injustice, the problem of slavery and racism in the American society. But on the other side, this is a different version of the end of history, but not in Fukuyama's term. But these people basically treated every historical person as their contemporary. They basically believe that Jefferson should be as sensitive to the, for example, lesbian issues like basically their classmates. So from this point of view, it's interesting to see to what extent you have a generation that cannot think in historical terms. They're taking all these people outside of there. And I do believe this is quite interesting because as a result of it, and this is my third and last point, you have the idea of a social change that is religious in its nature. We go there and we're going to change the world because we're going to change the mind of the people. We're going to change consciousness. And this is an interesting story. And from this point of view, of course, Trump is a kind of an interesting enemy for all these people because for him, everything is about power. And everything about power is the magic power of his words. He wants on his rallies. And on his rallies, he's making history. And these young people, they go under their protests. And on their protests, they're making history. Strangely enough, nobody is really interested in institutions and the institutional understanding of power. And this is going to be a huge story, because also what we see in places like Poland and other places, in a highly polarized society, the biggest losers is any type of institutions that position themselves as impartial. Be it public media, being courts, being independent central bank. In a polarized society, nobody is impartial. If I am not controlling you, it means that my enemy is controlling you. And I do believe for the liberal democracy, this is going to be the biggest issue. We're going to see much more political polarization, and this political polarization can easily end up in contested elections. Because don't forget, as a result of the COVID-19, more people are going to vote by post. Probably they're going to be electronic vote. I do believe in many countries we're going to see election postponed, election contested, elections not recognized. Poland was a great example. Kaczynski tried to push the elections in the middle of the COVID crisis. And I want to end up for something on Slovakia, Magda, because Bulgaria is very much the same. The problem of our governments is going to come that if there are not going to be a second wave in 2 months, all these people that have been praising the governments for helping our countries to have so small number of infected and people who died, they're going to say, but there was no any COVID anyway. We're going to be the center of denialism. We're going to claim that all this was a big conspiracy, that there was no COVID-19 at all, that everything was just basically a big economic conspiracy, this and that. So the governments who did very well in this public health of the crisis would be some of the governments that are going to have the biggest legitimacy issues during the economic part of the crisis. They're going to be in a certain way blamed for their political and economic success.
Absolutely. Ivan, just one question. You are a sociologist, so is Karolina, and so is Jiří, and so is Magdalena, actually. So it leaves me as a psychologist. About the young people, I mean, what you said about the relative diminution of the young cohort, does it also apply to countries like France and Germany and the Netherlands with a large number of foreign-born young people? Is it the same demographics, or is it slightly?
No, listen, in general, the young, of course, Eastern Europe is the most difficult from this point of view, because you don't simply have aging societies, but you have aging society that was, you have out-migration of young people that make it much more dramatic. But even in Germany and France, and don't forget, you don't have too many of the migrants on the streets, for example, of Germany and others. One of the interesting stories, there was 2 years ago, a very good survey being done by YouGov called the Tribes in American Politics. And they ended up with 6 different tribes. By the way, it was a much more psychological approach than the one that normally is done. And you have 2 groups of people, a kind of 100% progressives and 100% conservatives, both of them being around 86% of the population. And they have been, the progressives were progressive on every single issue, and the conservatives were conservative on every single issue. Do you know what is interesting? When it comes to the composition of these 2 groups, both of these groups were overwhelmingly white.
Yeah.
The problem with the racism, to a certain extent, and this is different from the 1968 when it comes to the racial question, is it's much more the radicalism comes from the white community than from the black community. Black community, and this is a new moment. This is an interesting moment. I'm not the greatest specialist on the American society, and basically Jacques has been teaching and living there much longer than me. But this is a new moment, and it's quite interesting moment. This is also explains part of it, radicalism.
So I just wanted to make 3 remarks. You started, Michal, with George Floyd and the protests after his death, and I instantly also thought about the protests in the UK concerning roads and the Roads Must Fall movement at Oxford. And I thought much of this movement is also connected to the fact that although the problem with roads and what he symbolizes and what the monument at Oxford symbolizes, the problem has been recognized already a couple of years ago, but basically almost nothing has happened. So it's this huge frustration that has been gathering somewhere beneath the surface, and now it's taking its form. Now, why? I believe that this has a lot to do with how the world has again accelerated in changing. So some of the revolution theorists and also early sociologists actually claimed that revolution is not something that starts something, but basically it actually ends a long process of an underneath change. And I do believe that this is exactly the case that we have here. And also, and my second remark is basically that we should see reaction to this deep change underneath on, so to say, one continuum. So I, for example, see the reactions after George Floyd's death as one of the ways to react to this deep changing quotidian reality, as if those people were saying, if the normality can be changed from one day to another, then let's just change it completely. Let's just get rid of the system completely. But on the other side of the continuum, as I said before, I see those politicians and also simply people, not only politicians, who say, let's just keep reality as it is, even if this meant that we have to close our eyes and just act as if there is no change. So this is what I think about those who for example, now would like to neglect the mere existence of the LGBT movement, community, also women's rights, etc., etc. And I just wanted to make a third point very quickly, because Floyd also caused me to think about democratizations of some more or less traditional institutions in our societies, namely kneeling in politics. We have all seen policemen and policewomen kneeling in public in front of the protesters. And I do believe that this is an extremely important moment that tells us something about what world we are actually living in now. When you think about kneeling in politics in the past decades, you will find, well, basically politicians or moral authorities who dared to make such gestures like Willy Brandt. But so to say, what is happening now is extremely democratized, because everybody can do it and represent either the community or him or herself. And I believe that this tells us something very important about the face of our democracy and how democracies have changed.
Well, you referred to me as old enough to be a 68er. I confess that is true. There are similarities. Some of them have been pointed just now. Youth rebellion, the challenge to establish all this. One big difference. 68 was radicalism phrased in universalist terms. There was a universalist project. You might dislike that project, you might challenge it, but it was still part of the Enlightenment project and of a certain utopian twist given to it with radical politics added to that. There was universalism there. In the current trend, what we see is something different, is the breakdown of the universalist approach and the vision of society through groups, and usually groups of victims. So this society is groups of victims, gender, race, etc., become the keys to understanding society. So the new politics against Trump in the United States or elsewhere is based on that. So this is a major shift from 68. A lot of the 68ers, particularly in France, are just amazed at what has happened. Now, all this comes now with the Floyd protest to Europe. And interestingly, the question of colonialism, slavery, etc., is being discussed. Carolina just referred to roads, etc. Well, that is something that we have in Western Europe. We do not have that in Eastern Europe, because the East Europeans look baffled at this discussion about the colonial past and slavery, etc. So this is something we do not yet have a shared history or shared debate of that kind of history. What we do have, however, is a shared propension to rewrite history, and that is very much shared, not just in Western Europe. They want to bring down statues, etc. But bringing down statues is, of course, something that people in Prague have recently witnessed. Erection of the Mariánsky slope. I'm not sure what the correct English version is.
It's a column.
Column, okay, the column brought down 1918, so you knock down the 1945 liberator of Prague, you bring down the Habsburg symbol of Catholicism. Okay, we are all united in this phrase. When universal projects are breaking down, societies are being fragmented, and we bring down, in the context of rewriting history, new symbols and war of symbols, war of memories. That is something that is fragmenting our societies and our politics today.
Yes, and we are latest of Milan Kundera before anyone's read it. Magdalena?
Yeah, thank you. Being brief, really, I want to say thank you to Ivan, because his essay, going through the text, brought me many ideas. And I will end this with the last paradox, that the closing the borders between EU members made us more cosmopolitan than ever. I think that this is true, and I hope it will last for a longer time. And this will be, and I think when I'm correct, this will be the atmosphere in Slovakia. So cross the fingers.
Thank you. And Jiří, you will have the last word of
no, it's about the symbols. It's interesting to be in this discussion for 2 hours and to see Ivan gradually going darker and darker. So I wonder whether it's another symbol. Yeah, it's but I liked and I completely share Ivan's view that this young generation is probably the first post-historical generation which doesn't want to know, doesn't understand, doesn't have the concept of historical time. So it will be accusing Gandhi of racism, Churchill of racism, without any historical understanding and forgiveness, and just playing this politics of identity, which is always brutal, whether it's on the right or whether it's on the left. And I think that this is a big issue in terms of after 9, I'm not 68er, I was too little, and as an 89er, we knew that after 89, we had to deal with the past. You just cannot abandon it. You have to comprehend, you have to come to terms, and you have to learn from it. Germans even have this word of Aufarbeitung, yeah, that you have to work through your past and work it out. And I'm afraid that we reach the stage when people want to delete the past. It's this political puritanism, unforgiving, and really there is a lot of authoritarianism in puritanism. So let's keep the world dirty and wonderful.
Well, thank you. Well, that's it for tonight on Havel channel. Let me thank profusely Karolina Wigura, Magda Vášáryová, Jacques Rupnik, Jiří Přibáň, and last, very importantly, Ivan Krastev, whose essay, Is It Tomorrow Yet?, inspired this debate. It seems to me that the answer to our question, will freedom survive the pandemic, has been a cautious yes, but whether freedom will really survive and how much of it ultimately depends on us all. From the Václav Havel Library in Prague, one of the best places to think about freedom and responsibility, this is Michal Žantovský. Thank you.